This is Dr. Alexander Rosenthal once again. Joined with me today is Dr. Miles Smith. Would you like to say hello again, Miles?
Hello, everyone. Great to see all of you back again. And for those of you joining us for the first time, it's great to have you on one of our Petrarch Institute video installations. Alex, did you want to tell them very quickly what Petrarch Institute is, what we do, and what we're about?
Yeah, so a Petrarch Institute is basically our way to sort of present classical learning to the general public at very low prices, right? So rather than having to shell out $37,000 a year or whatever the going rate is for an undergrad education, we want to be able to provide to the general public at very low prices a basic knowledge, foundational knowledge of the classics in an online learning format. So if you go to our website, which will be on this video, you can learn more about us and also have a look at our courses. We have one running now on Nietzsche and Socrates, for example. And you know, if you've come to this video, chances are you have at least some interest in the topics of history and philosophy, the humanities, the classics, and so forth, or at least one of those fields. So hopefully you'll take a look and find it interesting. So today what we're going to do is we've just finished a series on the so-called Axial Age, the period that Jaspers identified. Karl Jaspers, the German philosopher, identified as running from 800 BC to 200 BC, which saw foundational spiritual, intellectual, and cultural changes across the Eurasian landmass, from China, India, biblical Israel, and ancient Greece in particular, which have sort of provided much of the spiritual foundation for our civilizations ever since. And we've just completed a 6-part series on the Axial Age, which you can also have a look at on Petrarch. And now what we're going to do is go forward now to have a look at Rome. So Rome's importance. And I think Rome is kind of interesting because we often hear, and this goes back to actually a Roman, Tertullian, this whole idea that Western civilization is associated between these two poles, these two cities of Athens and Jerusalem, right? And that seems, you know, to many people who have some understanding of Western civilization, very clear, right? So Jerusalem is clearly the city which is associated with the predominant religious tradition of the Western world and with the Bible, Judaism and Christianity and so forth. Whereas we look at Athens and we see in Athens much of the original foundations of the intellectual life, of philosophy and mathematics, of our political discourses, of our literary forms and our artistic ideals and so forth. So much of Western civilization also goes back to Athens, and so much of Western civilization has been about the interplay between, let's say, these two poles of Greek intellectualism and biblical religion. And so it's all, you know, and then there's kind of the question, well, so where does Rome fit into all of this? And it's a topic that Remi Brague, French scholar, has talked about quite a bit, the centrality of Rome. Rome is sort of the missing city in this piece. You know, what is its contribution? Why study Rome? There's probably a lot of reasons, but there's 4 in particular that I want to suggest as a start for our discussion. So the first thing to keep in mind is that it is Rome which is the direct ancestor of the West European civilizations, right? Not the Greeks, right? As the British historian Christopher Dawson points out, the Greeks had really turned their attention much more to the east, although they had a few colonies in Italy and Spain and so forth. Their influence, right? Think of Alexander the Great, which is where we left off, right? Taking his armies eastward. And this is what Christopher Dawson writes. He says, the Romans were a people of soldiers and organizers, lawyers and engineers, road makers and land surveyors, whose achievement is summed up in the lapidary sentence, Balbus built a wall. Right? So this is about the pragmatism of the Romans relative to the Greeks. They had none of the genius for abstract speculation and the creative artistic imagination of the Greeks and their vast empire built up by harsh military discipline and ruthless political planning seems as inferior to Periclean Athens as the Colosseum is inferior to the Parthenon. Nevertheless, their work was extraordinarily enduring, and it served the cause of Western culture better than the more spectacular achievements of Alexander and his successors. While the latter was content to conquer the civilized East and covered it with a veneer of Hellenistic urban culture, the Romans drove their roads like a plow through the virgin soil of Western Europe and laid the foundation of new cities where none had stood before. Right? So the civilization of Western Europe, which is of course the ancestral civilization of the cultures of the Americas and Australia and New Zealand and so on, right? That civilization was built up directly by the Romans, right? And the Romans, unlike the Greeks, became politically unified. They politically unified Italy, and then they politically unified most of the known Mediterranean world, right? Well, basically all of the known Mediterranean world, and a lot more at that, right? So, there's that. Now, closely connected with that is the fact that the Greeks, although they're the original source of many elements in Western culture, they were received through the conduit of Roman culture, right? Closely related to this fact. And here again, let's turn to Dawson, who writes that I'll find you the quote. So he says that the greatest of all the services that Rome rendered to civilization is to be found in her masterly adaptation of the classical tradition of Hellenism, right, that is Greek culture, to the needs of the Western mind and the forms of Western speech, so that the Latin language became not only a perfect vehicle for the expression of thought, but also an ark that carried the seed of Hellenic culture through the deluge of barbarism. And thus the great classical writers of the 1st century BC, above all Cicero, Virgil, Livy, and Horace, have an importance in the history of Europe that far outweighs their intrinsic literary value, great as this is, for they are the fathers of the whole Western tradition of literature and the foundations of the edifice of European culture. Right? So those are quite strong words, but I think there's something to that if you think of the fact that the whole educational tradition, right, that begins with the study of these classical Roman authors who are mediating this Greek tradition to the Western European world, this is the basis of the medieval tradition of the trivium and the quadrivium, right? This is the tradition that goes forward through the Renaissance humanists. And as Dawson talks about, to the British public schools and the German gymnasia, right? So Rome becomes the mediator of Greek culture to, let's say, the Western portion of the European world, right? The Latin culture. A third thing is, I would say, I think we can make the case that Rome represents a principle of unity and perhaps of synthesis in Western civilization. Well, first of all, it's the meeting place of Athens and Jerusalem, right? It's where both Christianity and Greek culture sort of came together. But also, right, if you think about the close association of Rome with the political unity that Europe enjoyed under the Roman Empire, under a single law, right? But and the various efforts in the history of Europe to sort of recover that. Think of Charlemagne and so forth, right? There's always this turning back to Rome as this principle of unity on the political level. But perhaps even more important, right? Rome also becomes associated with the church, right? And the spiritually unifying factor of Roman Catholicism, which is the bearer of much of the Roman inheritance throughout the Latin language and the Roman cultural inheritance through much of the medieval world. So these two great institutions of the empire and the church, which have so influenced European history, I could think of them perhaps as the centripetal forces in Western culture, whereas of course there have been all kinds of centrifugal forces of nationalism and other things which tend to pull it apart. But the integrating, unifying forces have always had something to do with Rome. And we'll talk about the spiritual empire of Rome in the Middle Ages, right? Next time, perhaps. Now, a fourth element, which I think is quite important, was suggested to me by a British, I guess we'd say, educationist by the name of Richard Wynne Livingston at the turn of the century, when classical education was coming under increasing attack in Britain at the turn of the 20th century. He was saying, okay, well, having made the case for the Greeks, which is a relatively easy case to make, given the brilliance and foundational importance of so many Greek thinkers, why do we need to study the Romans, right? And he pointed to the element of character, right? I mean, if we think of what is it that what is it that allowed the Romans to govern not only Italy but most of the known world, right, and to be a byword for civilization, right, to the west for the next 7 centuries in the West, and then the Byzantine Empire lasts till the 15th century, right? I mean, the institutions, the political institutions that they built. What was it about the Romans, right? And if we look at sort of the solid virtues, right, of early Rome, particularly of the Republic, of the peasant, soldier, citizen, we see this kind of backbone, right, to the Roman culture. Virtus, right? Vir from meaning man, right? That's from our word virtue, right? The Roman virtus. One of the things that really brings this aspect of Rome home to me was in Rome's darkest hour, right, when Carthage, right, they found themselves at war, in a defensive war against Carthage, and Hannibal, the brilliant Carthaginian general, had been undefeated, had just wiped out a bunch of Roman armies. Finally, Rome sent its best against them, 80,000 men, and once again, Hannibal destroys the Roman army, kills 70,000 Roman troops, and basically the way is clear between the Carthaginian army and Rome. And Hannibal offers negotiations, and the Romans said, "We do not negotiate with the enemy on Italian soil." Right, right. So that kind of a backbone, which is very connected with, well, the Romans had the concept of the mos maiorum, right, the ways of the ancestors, the virtues or the customs of the ancestors, right, which of course includes this overarching idea of virtus or manliness, which gets extended into the general concept of virtue, but with three virtues in particular have of the Romans, of the old Romans, the traditional Romans, always get associated or always referred to by, including by many of the classical authors, and that is the 3 virtues of dignitas or honor, of pietas. I think we can connect pietas with what I just mentioned, right? The peasant, soldier, citizen. The sense that of reverence and homage that the Roman owed to his country, patriotism, to his gods, to his home and hearth, right? The deep sense of duty. And then gravitas, right? The sense of seriousness, of purpose, right? And so I think we have to look to the solid formation in these early Roman virtues to understood how this one city, right, was able to become mistress of the known world for centuries on centuries, right? Those are the 4 things that come to mind. And so the study of the Latin classics are really also perhaps didactic in terms of studying the virtues which are emphasized in Roman writings. So those are the four things that come to my mind. Did you have any thoughts, Miles?
Well, I think already a pretty low of getting people the idea that it's worth studying Rome. So I'm very loath to stand in the way of getting down to it. There are a number of areas in which the Romans are known for achievement, not just plowing roads and building viaducts and things like that. I guess to the general layman, to the things or to the areas where they encounter Roman language and culture, Latin, for example, are in politics and law. I guess both the Roman Republic and the Empire are models of study in the history of France and Britain and the United States and elsewhere. And of course, there's this idea that Roman law is about 85% of what we know, or 85% of the axioms for functioning modern economies, or societies under law, so to speak. So, I have the informed sense that you might want to talk a little bit about Roman politics and Roman law.
Yeah, no, I mean, I used to work in Washington, D.C., and if you have some knowledge of Roman history, it's just amazing how many allusions are there, from Capitol Hill, where the Senate sits, to all the neoclassical architecture that one sees and so forth, right? So one sees Roman models, and certainly not unique to the United States, Roman models everywhere. And certainly if you start to, for people who are interested in American history, if you start to study the Federalist Papers and so forth, you can see how important a knowledge of Roman history was for the American founders. I think the place to start would be the Roman Republic, right? So in the year 509 BC, by tradition, the last Roman king, Tarquinius Superbus, is ousted by two figures, Publius Publicola and Marcus Junius Brutus, right? Both of whom are important. That may ring a bell a little bit to those who are important, right? So Publius is the name taken up by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and so forth in the Federalist Papers, right? And of course, Brutus was also taken up by the Anti-Federalists, right? It was the name of one of the Anti-Federalists. They tended to take Roman names. So there's these two revolutionaries, in a certain sense, who ousted the last king. And so there's a hatred of monarchy that runs through, and sort of absolute power, right? And you see on all the Roman flags the Senatus Populusque Romanum, right? The Senate and people of Rome, right? This is the source of governance. Just discuss a little bit of these were the founders of the Roman Republic. Just discuss a little bit the structure of the Roman Republic, just in brief. So it was basically a tripartite structure, right? So you had on the one hand the executive magistracy, which were all term-limited executives, right? So again, we have always this concern about we don't want anyone to become a king or to monopolize power. The very idea of republic, res publica, right, refers to government as a public thing, right, as opposed to a monarchy where people might think of government as belonging to a family or something like that, right? The government is a public thing. So we have, the various magistrates, the quaestors. You would normally follow what they call a cursus honorum of moving up in the hierarchy. The quaestors were financial, treasurers, I suppose, in a certain way. The praetors were a kind of judge, up to consul, right? And the consuls had the highest executive authority in the Roman Republic, but they had the veto. It was very rare for there to be one consul. They would usually have two. And again, this was this concern about concentrations of power. And each one had a veto, or veto, as we would say, over the other, right? So, and then you had the censors, right, who were responsible. We have a lot of words that were derived from this. The census, right? They were responsible for taking the census, and drawing up the lists for the senates, and they also had responsibilities for public morality, hence our term censorship. The executive magistrates were chosen by popular assemblies, which is really the second part. And there was a kind of direct democracy. They had different kinds of popular assemblies for different sorts of things. So the comitia centuriata, for example, elected the higher magistrates on advice from the Senate, who we'll talk about in a minute. But it wasn't exactly a democracy because the Romans were divided between the patricians, or the upper class, and the plebeians, and the way that the votes were you voted in centuries in the centuriata, meaning the military, but they were not weighted exactly one man, one vote, right? So the patricians had more power, and there was a lot of jostling in Roman history between the patricians and the plebeians. Eventually, there was the concilium plebis, the council of the plebeians, right? Tended to gain in power, and they created an official, the tribune, who also had a veto power. And many measures were put to the plebeians in measures known as plebiscites, right? So you could see, I think, how much of just our everyday political terminology is derived from this. And then the third element of the Roman Republic was the Senate, right? And the Senate was a largely patrician council of former officials, elder statesmen. So you generally would have to go through the cursus honorum, at least to a certain level, before you were really eligible, right? And while in theory the Senate was an advisory body, the senatus consulta, right? They gave their advice on everything. In actual practice, because it was the regularly sitting group, and because of the prestige of these people, it was considered not good form to just outright reject what the Senate advised on a particular matter. So these were really the three elements. Now, I think a number of interesting things about this are discussed. Polybius and Cicero are the two. Polybius was a Greek author who lived in the 2nd century BC, and Cicero will discuss a bit. They were the two great defenders of this idea of the Roman Republic. And important to understand, right, you have to remember the Roman Republic had lasted well over 4 centuries by the time of Cicero. So he was really living in the decay of the Republic, right? Trying to appeal to the virtues of the old Republic, right? Against the tendencies that were going on in Rome. A couple of interesting concepts. One is the notion of mixed government, right? So if you remember, those of you who saw perhaps some of the stuff we've done on Aristotle and others, right? The Greeks talked about government of the one, monarchy, government of the few, aristocracy, government of the many, democracy. Where does Rome fit in? This is what Polybius, the Greek, was trying to figure out. And he said that, that it was impossible even for a native to pronounce with certainty whether the whole system was aristocratic, democratic, or monarchical. This was indeed only natural, for if one fixed one's eyes on the power of the consuls, right, the highest magistrates, the constitution seemed completely monarchical and royal. If on that of the Senate, it seemed again to be aristocratic. When one looked at the power of the masses, it seemed clearly to be a democracy. So it was a mixed form of government, right, which combines elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and the democracy. And Polybius will make the argument, and so will Cicero, that this mixed form is really the best, right? So that one does not get, the dangers of an out-of-control monarch are obvious, right? The tyrant or whatever. But they also saw dangers in the out-of-control demagogue who whips up popular sentiment on this issue or that issue, right? So this is a balanced constitution, and very important, they emphasize the idea of checks and balances, right? Based on the idea of the separation from powers, right? So such being the power, this is Polybius again, such being the power that each has of hampering the others or cooperating with them, their union is adequate to all emergencies, so that it is impossible to find a better system than this. And he goes systematically through what are the checks that each branch of the government has on the others, right? Now, if this sounds a little bit familiar to people who know something about the American Constitution, for example, it should be. So basically, Cicero, who sang the praises of this mixed system of separation of powers and of checks and balances, was taken up by Montesquieu in France during the Enlightenment, and Montesquieu, in turn, was read enthusiastically by the American founders, right? So these ideas of separation of powers, of checks and balances, of mixed government, right? All of these elements enjoyed a very powerful resurrection, we could say, in modern political thought, if you look at the 18th century. So that pretty much covers what I'd want to say about politics. I'm going to say just a few things about law, but were there any thoughts that you came to mind?
For the moment, I think we want to hear the story of this.
Yeah. So okay. So Roman law. I mean, it's important to mention that Roman law is by far the most, let's say, systems which have descended from Roman law. The civil law system is the most widely used system of law in the Western world. The Anglo-Saxon countries, for the most part, by the way, there's even exceptions there. Scotland uses Roman law, and so does Louisiana. Have a somewhat different tradition, though even there it's influenced by Roman concepts. But it's from the 12 Tables, which is the earliest known code of Roman law, through the great compilation of under just the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century A.D. With his Corpus Juris Civilis, which is this massive, let's say, codification of Roman law, which includes all these opinions of various jurisprudence through the centuries. Roman law, that whole structure of Roman law has had just an enormous influence on the whole concept of law in general in the West. And even certain basic ideas that we take for granted, like the notion that there should be a uniform code of law, the principle of universality, right? Is if you look at the history, and I think I've mentioned like the Ottoman Empire, for example, where each religious community had its own system of law, is not taken for granted elsewhere. So many of our basic concepts come from that. They had the principle of equity, that circumstances alter cases. So you don't treat the person who acts negligently the same way as the person who acts maliciously, to take one example. The law needs to be flexible. Law should proceed from a single sovereignty, in this case, in the theory of it at least, right, the Senate and people of Rome, right? They distinguish between public law and private law, which is a very basic distinction in our legal systems, right? So breach of contracts are treated, in private law, right? Whereas if somebody commits changes to a constitution or criminal law, right, are treated distinctly. One thing I think that is very interesting that ties into Cicero is the Roman interest in the concept of natural law, which was a borrowing from the Greek Stoics, right? So Cicero wrote, quote, in his De Republica, he wrote, "There is indeed, says he, a law agreeable to nature, and no other than right reason made known to all men, constant and perpetual, which calls us to duty by commands and deters us from sin by threats, and whose commands and threats are neither of them in vain to be good, though they may seem of little force to the wicked. The law we are neither allowed, this law we are neither allowed to disannul nor to diminish, nor is it possible it should be totally reversed. The Senate or the people cannot free us from its authority, nor do we need any other explainer or interpreter of it besides ourselves, nor will it be different at Rome and at Athens, now and hereafter, but will eternally and unchangeably affect all persons in all places," right? So we have this ideal of a natural law, which is to say, even before the formal laws made by the government or the state, there is a moral law which binds all human beings, which is universal, which the government has neither the power to add nor to subtract to, right? And that, I would say, the idea of natural law is something which is important because it provides a standard by which, for example, the civil laws can be judged, right? If a given ruler makes a law that, everybody has to bring me a pound of gold on Tuesday, right? We have a standard to judge that against. There's something arbitrary about that kind of law, right? And a lot of they gave great importance to the principle of private property, which I think is an essential Western value. Not all cultures have similar concepts of private property. They divided the law into acts against persons, things, and the law of action. And they had a kind of genius for categorization and legal concepts. So I think that's probably what and I think that would be one of the most continuing influences of Rome in today's world. Is just they provided the juridical concepts which have continued to govern it.